What does Ezekiel tell us was the reason for God's anger against Israel? Specifically from Ezekiel, what does Ezekiel say he is so upset about? You guys know? Idolatry. Okay, I mean, I'm going to sum it up with idolatry. There's pieces to that we're going to look at today. But really what it comes down to is idolatry. Worshiping other gods. Okay, that is really the big issue going on. And as you can guess, when they worship other gods, what happens to the culture? Changes. What happens to the people's attitudes towards God? Changes. All these things start to permeate the society, and the society changes. Okay? Well, when we get into the later chapters of Ezekiel, we won't even be able to read some of the stuff because of how graphic it is. We literally will have to skip it. It would be, I'd have to put like a sign on the door and like 18 plus because it's that bad. Really, it's that bad. And so it's very calmed down and tempered in our text because the Bible scholars want you to be able to read your whole text. But if it read as it does in Hebrew, you wouldn't be able to read it without a some kind of a mature rating on it because it's so graphic. So we're going to get to some of that. We're going to sum that up a little bit when we get there, but it is really, really bad what was happening. So let's look at Ezekiel chapter 5. We'll just start here, okay? It says, "Thus says the Lord Yahweh, this is Jerusalem in the midst of the nations where I have put her, and countries are around her. But she has rebelled against my regulations to the point of wickedness more than the nations, and my statutes more than the countries that are around her, for they rejected my regulations, and as for my statutes, they did not walk in them." So this is kind of an initial pronouncement, is there's two things that God says they violated, his regulations and his statutes. Okay? One of those you can guess was don't make graven images, no idolatry and those things. It probably wasn't just that they broke that rule, but that's a big one, right? You notice he says, she has rebelled against my regulations more than the nations around. They were worse than the pagans, worse than the pagan countries that did not receive the law of God. So it's not just they became lax. They literally went so much worse than even the ungodly nations around them. So when you think Sodom and Gomorrah, they were pretty bad. They got wiped out. Here you have, Israel has embraced stuff that may even be borderline where they are, or even worse. Let's go on. Look in Deuteronomy 4. So we're going way back to when they first got the law and the statutes, and look what it says. "See now, I now teach you rules and regulations just as Yahweh my God had commanded me." Who's writing this? Moses. Okay. It says, "To observe them just so in the midst of the land where you're going, to take possession of it. And you must observe them diligently, for that is your wisdom and your insight before the eyes of the people who will hear all these rules, and they will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people." In other words, Moses says, I'm giving you everything that God gave me, and it's going to immediately give you wisdom, and the nations around you are going to say, wow, these people are more wise than any other. And what has happened? The exact opposite.
They didn't use that wisdom.
They did not use that wisdom. They didn't observe the things that God commanded them, and so the exact inverse happened. Not only were they not wise, they're more unwise and more wicked than even the nations around them that never got the law, never got the regulations. What happens to a country that does that? Takes the law of God and rejects it and even does the opposite of it.
Sounds like today.
It's definitely not, yeah, it does sound like today. It turns wisdom into folly, right? It's crazy. You notice how he says the statement at the very end, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people. That's what the nations around them are going to say. What are they saying now? In fact, God actually tells Ezekiel the nations are going to look at this and they're going to see ruins and they're going to see desolation. They're going to say, wow, what did they do? They must have turned against their God. So there's this inverse of making an example, not just for the people of Israel to respond, but for the nations around to see what's going on. See what's happening. It says, for what great nation has for it a God near to it as Yahweh our God whenever we call upon him? And what other great nation has for it just rules and regulations, just like the whole law that I am setting before you today? So this was Moses talking to the nation. In other words, you guys are unique because there is no other nation that has God in their midst like this one. And what have they done with it? Squandered it, right? Goes on to say, however, take care for yourself and watch your inner self closely, so that you do not forget the things that your eyes have seen, so that they do not slip from your mind all the days of your life, and you shall make them known to your children and to your grandchildren. So what does God want them to do per Moses here in Deuteronomy? What was he telling them was critical for their success, their survival as a country, and as a nation? Don't forget the rules and regulations. Observe them, carry them out, guard your heart, guard your inner self, make sure your personal being is devoted and doing the right things, and then you need to make sure you're passing that through your family, teaching it to your kids so that they're teaching it to their kids, and so it continues on and doesn't stop. Because if they stop doing that, what's going to happen? It's all going to come apart. And unfortunately, what happens when Ezekiel is now on the scene? It's all come apart. It's all come off the rails. He says this back in Ezekiel chapter 5. Therefore, thus says the Lord Yahweh, because of your commotion, more than the nations that are around you, you did not walk in my statutes, and you did not do my regulations, and according to the regulations of the nations that are around you, you did not do. Therefore, thus says the Lord Yahweh, look, even I am against you, and I will execute judgment in the midst of you before the eyes of the nations, and I will do with you that which I have not done, and which I will not do again because of all your detestable things. There's a couple things he mentions in this particular section that you just got to kind of pay attention to. You notice he says here, because of your commotion more than the nations around you. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by commotion? It's kind of like an interesting phrase that literally means that they're making more noise, like we're not talking positive here, than even the pagans. Okay? They're more getting the attention than the pagans, and not in a good way, are they? Because of what they're doing. He also makes the statement there, therefore, thus says the Lord Yahweh, look, even I am against you. You know, that phrase in the ancient Hebrew is actually like a challenge to a duel. That's a phrase you would use if you're challenging someone to a duel. Isn't that weird? And so what is God saying? Let's duel, right? It's time to go. And the one who used to be in the midst, who they came to for protection, is now the one challenging them to the fight. Is it really going to be a fight? No. It's going to be a slaughter. A slaughter. But it's this, hopefully you're getting the idea here that when, from God's perspective and the way he's talking, is very much a battle. It's very much, you're my adversary. It's very much, I'm against you. You know, you've broken the rules, and now you're going to pay for it. And so Ezekiel has to go out and relay these things to the exiles, to the people there. You know, what was their response? You know, hopefully it turns, they turn their minds to things. But do you think that there was people there in the community still waiting for God to come and rescue them? They thought, there's no way God's going to destroy his city. There's no way God's going to allow the temple to be destroyed. There's no way any of this is going to happen. Yeah, there is. There's people that think that. And then what happens? He does it. He does it, absolutely. You notice he uses this phrase, because of all your detestable things. When God says something's detestable, what does he mean by detestable? There's probably a lot of detestable things. Can you think of some things?
They eat their children.
Eating your children would be detestable. Yep. I think if you looked up detestable, again, this is kind of my definition, anything that violates the order of nature, anything that violates the way God designed it or ordered it himself through his law is detestable. In fact, there's even foods like animals that you eat that are considered detestable. In Judaism, is there detestable foods? Yeah. Pigs, yeah. Anything with a specific kind of hoof, it's unclean. Those are detestable, right? Detestable things. Here's
also offering their children to Moloch.
Yep, offering your children to Molech would be detestable. Yep. So a lot of those things, here's one that I thought was kind of interesting. God calls detestable. Deuteronomy 22:5, the apparel of a man should not be put on a woman, and a man shall not wear the clothing of a woman, because everyone who does these things is detestable to Yahweh your God. I thought that one kind of fit today. As crazy as it is, I kind of came across that one and was like, why does God hold something like this detestable?
Because it is.
It's confusing. It is detestable. Yeah, we can agree on that. Why does he seem to be so against? And I think it's the order. Don't you think it's an order issue?
Goes against nature.
Goes against the way it was designed. Men are supposed to be men. Women are supposed to be women. There's specifically things designed for men and women. And you don't confuse the two. You don't mix the two. Remember when God would say, like, don't take this kind of cloth and mix it with this and weave a... He likes things a certain way. And there's certain things that he says, listen, I've set this over here. You don't mix it with this thing. Okay? You keep them separate. And God does that because he has an order. He has a role for this thing and a role for that thing, and he doesn't want that violated. But what happens when man gets involved? Starts to mix the things that shouldn't be mixed, starts to do the things he shouldn't be doing, and all of a sudden these orders start to go out the door, and the detestable starts to rear its head. Here's Deuteronomy 32. Again, back to Moses. I'm kind of flipping back and forth, from where Moses was telling them what they needed to do. Like the contract, the whole agreement was do these things. And now we're in Ezekiel where the things have been violated and God's calling the contract and saying, okay, guys, today it's strictly a legal issue. I'm bringing you to court. We're at battle. And I have the documentation to support that I'm justified in doing this. So here's Deuteronomy 32. And Jeshurun grew fat, and he kicked. You grew fat, you bloated, and you became obstinate, and he abandoned God, his maker, and he scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods. With detestable things they provoked him. They sacrificed to the demons, not God, to gods whom they had not known, new gods who came from recent times. And so the God that ultimately saved them from Egypt, gave them the law, saw them into the land, what did they do to him? Turned their back on him. Yeah. Out the door. And then they brought in what else? Other gods. Yeah. And it's interesting because even idols are obviously these representations of gods. Anything could be an idol, that they would bow down and worship. But they actually grabbed onto the gods of these other nations. Baal worship. One of them we're going to look at in a minute started to worship the host of heaven, worship the stars. They got into all these, we'll call them lesser deities. Right here, it seems to me that Moses is saying you're sacrificing to demons. In other words, there's members of the host that either have fallen. We've talked a lot about that in this class. The demonic entities out there became, we'll say, lower G gods, and they were worshipped. Their ancestors had not known them. Isn't that an interesting statement? Who are the ancestors of the Jews? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You think about when God introduces himself, who does he introduce himself as? You got to be, I would say, I'm trying to lift these guys up because they were still fallen men, but when God is willing to identify specifically to you as a God of another human being, that must have been a person of great faith. He doesn't just say, I am God. He says, I'm the God of Abraham. Oh my, God will identify with people who are faithful to him. He is happy to do that. He's happy to do that. Ezekiel, back into Ezekiel 5:11. Look what he says. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Yahweh. When God says that, you think it's going to happen? When he says, surely as I live, you're really not going to get much, more guarantee on that. Surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all of your vile idols and with all of your detestable things, now indeed I will reduce, and my eye will not take pity, and surely I will show no compassion. It's like God saying, I'm going to just kind of harden my heart to this, and we're going to take care of it. Now, specifically here, what's he upset about? Obviously idols, but where are the idols?
In the sanctuary.
They have not just made it on the outskirts. They are right in the midst of the sanctuary, right in the temple, right inside. We're not talking about an allowance for these things. We're talking about a replacement of God. They have taken these things and put them in the most holy of places where God dwelled. Remember? What's the purpose of the temple being built? Why did Solomon build it? Yeah, a place for my name to rest, a place for me to be in the midst of the people. And what have they done to God's house? Goes on to say this in chapter 6. And the word of Yahweh came to me saying, Son of man, set your face to the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. What's the mountains of Israel? That would be the highest points, right? Where's Jerusalem sit? Right at the highest point, right? Mount Zion, right? And you must say, mountains of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord Yahweh to the mountains and to the hills. And then he goes all the way to the bottom, to the ravines and the valleys. There is no place that's not touched by this. Look, I'm bringing upon you the sword, and I will destroy your high places, and your altars will be desolate, and your incense altars will be broken, and I will throw down your slain ones before your idols, and I will place the corpses of the children of Israel before their idols. The very things that you introduced, God is not only going to devastate, but what's he going to do? He's going to say, fine, you wanted them, I'm going to put you right at their feet. There's like it's with God, it's not just as easy as just like, you're gone. It's like, I'm going to make a statement with your end. He does this repeatedly. I'm not just going to take you out, I'm going to embarrass you in the process for standing against me. I'm going to throw the corpses of the children of Israel at the feet, before these idols. Why would you say that? Like, what is he saying with that statement?
Getting their attention.
It's going to get their attention, but what is there? Is there a competition between Yahweh and these other gods going on? And what is he saying? I'm going to show my power. And here, you thought these things could save you. You're going to be dead at their feet. What does that tell you? They have no power. They can't save you. They can't fight on your behalf. There's nothing they can do to deliver you from my hands. So what would you think a person would say? I might be serving the wrong being here, but they didn't. Now I want you to think back when we talked about the sign acts. Was that last week when we did sign acts? And God shaving, having Ezekiel shave his beard and his head, and he scatters all this hair. Do you remember the disrespectfulness of a priest or a man shaving his head and his beard? That was a very dishonoring thing. And so God is dishonored. He feels dishonored. He has been dishonored. And when you dishonor God, the nations are going to see it, but God's not going to just let it fly, right? He's going to deal with it. And he's going to make a statement of who's ultimately the authority, who's the highest power. There's a competition that seems to go on in the Old Testament. It's all of these other beings against Yahweh. And God always comes out on top. Yahweh always comes out on top. And it just seems like it takes him forever to figure that out. And when are we going to figure that out? Like, we just chase everything. We don't call it an idol, but do we have them all over around us today? And we just chase stuff, and our country chase stuff, and our culture chase stuff. And yet, when we have a tragedy or we have something, what happens? Well, we better pray, and we better ask God for help, but the rest of the time it's all nothing. Nothing about him. Let's go on. He says, I will scatter your bones around your altars. In all of your dwellings, the cities will be desolate, and the high places will be ruined, so that your altars will be desolate and will suffer punishment. Your idols will be broken and will come to an end, and your incense altars will be cut down, and your works will be destroyed, and the slain one will fall in the midst of you, and then you will know that I am Yahweh. I think, isn't there a song about, there's an old sermon, I think it was a Jonathan Edwards sermon about, people who fall into the hands of a wrathful God, and it was just this like turn or burn, like you don't want to do that because it's not going to end well. I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, right? Not going to be a good situation. So God mentions a number of things that are a problem. Obviously, we kind of know the big gist as they had turned away from him, but he highlights specific named things in this. He talks about the high places being destroyed. Okay, what is a high place? We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. He talks about the altars being destroyed. Talks about the incense altars specifically being brought down and idols being brought down. So you have all these things named in the text against Israel by Ezekiel. These are the problems. Okay? And I want to just make sure we understand that this is not like metaphorical fun language to just highlight that they worshipped other gods. These are specific things in Israel that they were engaged in. Very specific things. Okay? And they're all this. They're all detestable. And they had just continued to grow and get out of hand and continue to become a problem. And God eventually said, nope, it's time for them to go. They'd even made it into the sanctuary. Okay? Look at this in 1 Samuel. We're going way back. Okay? This is when things were still moving in a positive light. Okay? It says, they were going up to the ascent of the town where they found young women going out to draw water. They said to them, is the seer here? They answered them and said, there is. Look, he is in front of you. Hurry now, because he has come to the town today, because there is a sacrifice for the people today at the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat, for the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Okay, it's kind of a weird bunch of verses. But they're in this town, and there's about to be a sacrifice today. And who are they looking for? Samuel. Is Samuel a godly man? Yeah, he's the prophet. Yeah, he's the prophet. And what's he doing in this town on this particular day? Where's he going? And where's the sacrifice at? It's at the high place. And he's doing it. He's participating in it. Does that mean Samuel's a bad guy and he's doing something he shouldn't have been doing? Or are these high places at one point a little bit different than they ended up before the destruction? There's actually several verses here. I'm giving you an example of one here. Let me see if I have a little bit more. Here we go. Then afterward, the invited guests will eat. So then, go up, because you will find him today. So they went up to the town. As they were entering into the middle of the town, Samuel was coming forth to meet them to go up to the high place. There was a time in the Old Testament, and here in 1 Samuel and in other places, where the high places didn't have the negative connotation that they did later on. That sounds really weird. But it's almost like these places were a place where people would go if they couldn't make it into Jerusalem. And you have to remember, the temple may not be built at this point. You may not have the temple built. David's still a kid. So where are they going to worship Yahweh? Remember, they had the tent, but now that they're in the land, what happens? Where do they go? Where does God reside? What if you can't make it there, right? So the idea here is that there was a time when God actually said, you can go to this place and you can offer your worship to me. You can sacrifice to me because I'm, the one you're worshiping. I'm the one you're coming to. And the high places didn't seem to be quite an issue. In fact, Samuel even ends up going up there. So what happened to these high places? Corruption. What used to be for God, they corrupted and turned to evil. They turned it to other gods, right? That's a problem. Look at this in 1 Kings. But the people were sacrificing on the high places, for the house for the name of Yahweh had not yet been built in those days. We don't have the temple. So where are they going to go? I'm up in the north. We have the land now. I'm up here. I can't go there because there's only one tent, right, with the ark in it and where they would, the traveling tabernacle. What if you can't get there? What if, it's packed up? What do you do? How do you go and you offer your sacrifice? How do you give to the Lord? They would go to the high places. They would go to these particular designated areas, and they would have a, service, or they would have a sacrifice. Okay. 1 Kings chapter 12. Then he built the houses on the high places, and he appointed priests from all walks of life who were not from the sons of Levi. Who's doing this? Jeroboam. Okay, so he is not a great godly king. Now, he's the guy, if you remember last week, the sign act, he had a sign act that was given to him. Do you remember what it was? There's a priest, Abijah, who catches him and rips his new coat, right, into 12 pieces and gives him 10 of them and says, you get these 10, right? And that's in the north, okay? So you're talking Israel in the north, not Judah in the south. He gives Jeroboam the 10 pieces, symbolically saying, you get the northern kingdom, okay? I'm going to rip it away from Saul. You're going to have the north. Okay, and so what does Jeroboam do in the north? He has these high places, and so now, look what it says. Jeroboam inaugurated a religious feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the religious feast which was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. Thus he did in Bethel by sacrificing to the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. State-sanctioned idol worship here. Now you have idolatry going up in the north, and it's run by the official who's in charge. He's not only created a feast, but he has these specific locations where he had calves built. And the idea was, we always think of calf worship. It is Baal worship. But in this time, they kind of had the idea that Jerusalem's too far south, and Jeroboam was afraid that if people left the north and went to the south to Jerusalem, they wouldn't come back. So what happens to his kingdom? It starts to disappear. And so he wanted to keep the people in the north. And so what do you have to provide them? Place to worship, a place to offer sacrifices. And so he knows the Levite priests, the one who are authorized, are in the temple. They're in Jerusalem where they should be, right? And so what ends up happening? Nope, we're going to have something up north here, and that's where you're going to come and you're going to worship. You're not going to go to the synagogues. You're not going to go to Jerusalem where you're supposed to go. You're staying north. So he just turns these calves into, well, you can worship Yahweh there. And so people did. And he kept them there. So this is where now you have a perversion of the system, and it's not only done by people because they just didn't have anywhere to go, but now you have the specific leaders of the northern kingdom saying, this is what we sanction. We're sponsoring this. This is where we want you to go. But specifically for when it came to offering your sacrifice, you really needed to go to Jerusalem, because why did you want to go there? It wasn't just because you were told to, but who was there?
The temple and the priest.
God was there. That's where Yahweh was. That's where he resided. So you wanted to go where he was. And here Jeroboam is saying, no, stay up north. We'll provide you a place to go do these things. Okay? This was the beginning of these things being distorted, starting to go the wrong way. It says he offered sacrifices on the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, which his heart had devised. He inaugurated a religious feast for the Israelites, and he went up to the altar to offer incense. So think about it. It's a new holiday. We now have a new national day, and we're going to have a special event, and we're going to have this special occasion, and people are like, cool, let's go. And they have this thing that they're going to celebrate every year, and it's not in Jerusalem. It's at the high places in the north. Calves is where they're worshiping, up by them. So what was he doing by this? Taking away from what God wanted and making it his own. And this was the beginning of it.
He is controlling the people.
I can control the people. Yep, there's political pieces to that. But the people should have said, we can't go there. We need to go to Jerusalem. But what do? They listen to their leaders, and their leaders lead them down the wrong road, and so they think it's okay because he's the king, and God inaugurated the king, and it's okay. And then what do? They fall into that because they follow the leaders, and the leaders are not leading them the right direction. And then it's a slow drip. And pretty soon everything just starts to fall apart because people start to invite. If they compromise this, then they'll compromise that, and they'll compromise this. 2 Kings 21. Now we're in where it's real bad. Manasseh's really bad. Okay, this is, I believe, Hezekiah's son. Okay, Hezekiah was good. Manasseh not so good. Okay, he was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. The name of his mother, there she is. He did evil in the eyes of Yahweh according to the detestable things of the nations that Yahweh had driven out from the presence of the Israelites. He returned and rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made a pole of Asherah worship, just as Ahab, king of Israel, had made, and he bowed down to all of the host of heaven, and he served them. So what did Hezekiah do during his reign? Do you remember? What did he do? He was kind of the reformer. He came in, he saw this bad stuff happen, and so what did he do? We're done with this. These high places have turned into idol worship locations, knock them down. So what does he do? He comes in and he devastates them all. And then, did that really last? No. He was kind of like the Band-Aid guy. He came in and he said, we're knocking these things down, it's not right. And then his son comes in and says, I'm not even going to just rebuild them, we're going to build them better. We're going to put them in worse places. This guy is as bad as it gets. And so you can see the battle went on in Israel for a long time because they were trying, there was kings that would come in and they would try to get reforms through from a state-sponsored position to get things back on track for the people. But what was the problem? The people were so accustomed to having it their way that it's kind of like we always make the joke, if you give the government a new agency, the agency will never disappear, right? It'll never happen. That's kind of like us. You give us a little taste of this. You spoil us a little bit by making it easier for us. You can't take it away. Could you imagine if you took iPhones and smartphones away today? The world would shut down. It would be over. Because we're so accustomed to the conveniences, when you take them away, people usually rebel, right? They don't do well with that. Here's what Manasseh does. He comes back in and says, I'm putting them back up. Do whatever you want. And here you have Baal. You have Asherah, so you have named specific deities, from the north, Canaanite deities, and you have the host of heaven. Specifically things you're told not to worship. What is man asked to do? We're going to take those things and that's what we're going to worship. Bad situation. I want to show you this here real quick in Hebrew. You can see this word. It's hamaneh, okay? You kind of have it highlighted there. You can see up the very top there, it says, and will come to an end, and your incense altars will be cut down. This is from Ezekiel, that hamaneh. They translate that incense altars, but it actually is probably not specifically what it means, okay? Your incense altars will be cut down. That term can mean something hot. It literally means hot. Some actually even take that term and title it with Baal Hamon, who was a kind of fire. It was his symbol. And so they're not sure if this was an incense altar. Why would they render this incense altar, you think? What do you do at an incense altar? You burn something, so it's hot. So the translators are thinking maybe it's an incense altar that they put in there. But it's very possible that this actually could be a chapel. There's a term that's used that's very similar to this that can mean a chapel or a building. In other words, it's not an altar, it's an actual little church that these guys built, and they'd put the idol in it and then they would worship. Could be an incense altar, but it could be that they had churches popping up all over that were for idols. They put the idol in there and you could go in there and you could worship. And if it is in fact a chapel or a building, God says he's going to do what to it? It's coming down. I'm going to knock that place to the ground. And did that happen? Absolutely. When Nebuchadnezzar came in, they just raised those things right to the ground, right? Let's look at idols. Ezekiel 6:4 says, "And I will throw down your slain ones before your idols." So we had some high places, which we know what those were, right? They were places they would go do their sacrifice, they would worship. We kind of know what incense altars were. Could be chapels, or it could be an incense altar. Your idols. Now this one made me kind of chuckle, but I think this kind of is starting to give you a flavor for Ezekiel's a little graphic sometimes. Okay, he's a little graphic. Okay, there's the word idol that Ezekiel uses. Okay, gilulim. Okay, is the Hebrew term. He actually takes the term and he changes it in how it's written, but he also changes it in how it's vocalized. It's kind of weird. So it's kind of his own term. Okay, that he uses. Now, I'm going to give you what one of the commentators I followed said on this, because I think he said it the best. Okay, this is Daniel Block's commentary. Here's what he says. The name has nothing to do with the shape of idols, but it expresses Ezekiel Yahweh's disposition toward them. Modern sensitivities prevent translators from rendering this expression as Ezekiel intended it to be heard, but had been preaching today, he would probably have identified these idols with a 4-letter word for excrement. So that's what I want to show you. So Ezekiel is not afraid to get a little raw. And so if you were a Hebrew reader, that's what you would have come away with. Okay? Translated into our culture. I'm going, okay, Ezekiel, but this is just what he does. When we get later on, we can't even read some of it because he's so graphic with things. So I don't know if that's Ezekiel's attitude or if it's personality. Why would he use this phrase? Because what does he think idols are? Crap. Okay? I mean, to say it lightly, that's what he's saying they are. Okay? Verses 8 and 9 says, "But I will spare some, so there will be for you fugitives from the sword among the nations where you are scattered in the countries, and your fugitives will remember me among the nations to which they were taken captive. Now that I have shattered by their adulterous heart which departed from me, and by their adulterous eyes which went after the idols, and they will feel loathing for themselves for the evil that they did, for all of their detestable things." So what does he say is going to happen in this verse? There's going to be those who are going to get out. They're not going to die by famine or the sword. They're going to be scattered. What's going to happen to them internally?
Feel ashamed.
They're going to wake up and say, you know what we have done? Do we realize what we've done? They're going to be ashamed. They're going to loathe themselves. They're going to be upset for how this all went down. They're going to realize the evil that they did. And I put this in there specifically to remind you that this is not God saying there will be no one left. There's a lot of people gone. A lot of people are devastated when Nebuchadnezzar comes in. But God always has a group that he allows to go whether you want to say he allowed them to get out of the city, they somehow escaped the sword, they escaped famine, they got scattered. And when they reflect back, they realize they need to repent. What I have done is wrong. What does God do with those people? Do they stay in the faraway countries? Eventually get to come home. Eventually many of them get to come back. Because, I think, it's because God is gracious to those who will come and acknowledge, I've sinned against you. He'll forgive all of the stuff we just read about. If they would just get on their knees and in trueness of heart and mind say, God, what we have done is wrong. We've done wrong against you. Have mercy. Forgive us for what we've done. And what will God do? It's hard to get to that. It's hard for us to accept that, really to realize that it's not that hard if we're honest, and we just will be honest with ourselves, this whole inward looking thing. If we'll just be honest, God's willing to say, I will forgive you. Even the worst things you could possibly do. They messed up his own house. They had idols in his own sanctuary. Next week, we're going to look at that in detail because there's a lot of problems. But God's willing to say, if you'll repent, I'll even forgive you for that. That's kind of wild to me. Verse 11 through 13 says, violence has grown to become a staff of wickedness. None from them will remain, and none from their abundance, nor from their wealth and prominence will not be among them. The time has come, the day has arrived. Let not the buyer rejoice, and let the seller not mourn, for anger is on all their multitude. For the seller will not return to the merchandise while they are still alive, for the vision is about all of its multitude. It will not change, and a man, because of his guilt, will not be able to hold on to his life. The economy will crash. It won't matter, buyers and sellers, when this happens, it's all coming down. The economy's going to go with it. People won't care what they got for sale. I actually read one commentary that said that Jubilee year will be canceled. Remember they used to cancel their debts and everybody got a fresh start? Not this year. Canceled. Because you're going to pay. There's not going to be the forgiveness of debts. You're going to pay for them today. And in fact, they got kicked out, obviously. It was not a good situation. Goes on to say this, the sword is outside and the plague and the famine are inside. The one who is in the field will die by the sword, and the one who is in the city, famine and plague will devour him. And if the survivors will escape, they will be on the mountains like the doves of the valley, all of them groaning, each because of his guilt. All of the hands will hang limp, and all of the knees will be wet with urine. Isn't that weird? Actually, we'll say in some versions, with waters will run. But this is not the scrubbed clean version. Okay, this is the literal. In other words, there's going to be people. You think of this idea of their hands hanging limp and they're wetting their pants. That's really what it says because of the siege that's coming. When they look out and they see this army and they realize their death is right at the corner, that's what's going to happen. It's just imagery of just how these people are not prepared, and they're going to be totally terrified when they realize what's coming their way. Not a good illustration. When you think of being in that place, I'd go, oh my goodness, how terrible, right? Verse 19 says, their silver they will discard on the streets, and filth will be their gold. Their silver and their gold will not be able to rescue them on the day of the wrath of Yahweh. Maybe underline that one if you're taking notes. It will not be able to rescue them on the day of the wrath of Yahweh. What did they take their strength in a lot of times? How much money they had, their stuff. And he's saying when it comes, you can't buy your way out of it. There won't be a product you can purchase because there won't be anything for sale. It'll be over. And that will be worthless stuff. Look at the temple here in verse 20. Here's what it says. And the beauty of its ornament he made into a prideful thing, and made with it their detestable things and their vile idols. Therefore I will make it into an impure thing for them, and I will give it into the hand of strangers as plunder, and to the wicked people of the earth as spoil, and they will defile it. And I will turn my face from them, and they will defile my treasured place, and the violent ones will enter and defile it. What about the temple? What's going on? We've talked about the city. We've talked about this. So what's going to happen to God's house when all of this comes down? The thing that was their pride and joy is now what? It's now even a detestable thing with idols in it. And it's going to be destroyed. It's going to be captured. It's going to be taken away. It's interesting when you look at some of these things that are going to happen. I just kind of made a brief list of just some of the things that God talks about. The instrument of God's judgment will arrive. It's going to be coming. That's Nebuchadnezzar, right? The land is going to be destroyed. They would typically burn up the fields outside. They would just torch the land. That way you couldn't get any food, right? You couldn't even get it outside of the city. They're going to collapse your economy because you can't buy and sell. Nobody cares now what things are worth because they're just trying to survive. Your gold isn't, unless I can eat it, it has no value, right? People always ask me, well, should we invest in gold? You know, I'm always going, well, can you eat it? I mean, I understand the inflation protection idea, but if it really got too bad, would somebody trade you a loaf of bread for a bar of gold? I wouldn't. I'd keep the bread, right? I think that's kind of what happened here. Eventually they got to the point where it's like, I'd do anything for just a loaf of bread. Didn't matter. People will die of all these different things, horrendous deaths, eating their children, trying to survive because there's no food. They've been sieged. They're going to be scattered from their homes. So where they were living just, days before, now they're out, gone, moved to a whole new area. Now this is an interesting one. The country's sacred monuments and symbols are going to come down. What identified Israel? What was their sacred symbol? The temple, wasn't it? The temple. Gold-plated, massive structure. And what happens when Nebuchadnezzar comes in? That symbol that was of where God resided, that gave them the power and the strength and his people, what happens? It's gone. And not only that, it's become detestable. It's become vile because it's filled with all kinds of impurities. It's filled with idols. And the stuff that was going on there is just terrible. And so it's like an inverse happens. The land that was God promised he would make sure to bless, so you had plenty of food, what's happened to it? Burned up. Place that God lived, that was the joy of the nation, has now become a symbol of their destruction, symbol of their detestable things. They're going to be plundered. What they had is gone. All these terrible things happen. Now, this is always a little bit of hope. Some will come to their senses. I do like the fact that, in the midst of all of this, what does God tell them? There's going to be some that when they get on those mountains and they look back and they see the city burning and they're scattered and they think about what's happened, they're going to say, I know why we did. I know why this took place. And they're going to look inwardly and they're going to feel guilty and they're going to realize it was because of the sin. What's all of the prophets after this, typically their response when they talk to God? Think about Jeremiah. He's so upset for the people. Forgive us for what we've done. He even includes himself in that. Daniel prays, forgive. He's confessing the nation's sins. He confesses his own sins when he goes into prayer time. Because these guys have come to their senses, if not were already in their right mind, and said, why we know why this has happened. And that's an important piece, is people coming to their senses. Think about it today. People are going along and they're living their own life. And then what happens? The gospel comes and they have a chance to come to their senses. And they can respond to that and then it can change course. They can come back to be with God, right? God really hasn't done anything different. He's changed it a little bit. You get into the New Testament and the temple's rebuilt during Jesus' day. What happens to the temple? It gets destroyed by the Romans. And how do you make it right with God? You don't come to the temple. What do? You come to Jesus in broken and contrite heart. You ask for forgiveness. And what happens? You're forgiven. You're forgiven. It's not about coming to the temple. It's about coming to God, right? Verses 9 and 10, and your fugitives will remember me among the nations to which they were taken captive, that I was scattered by their adulterous heart, which departed from me, and by their adulterous eyes which went after their idols. And they will feel loathing for themselves for the evil that they did, for all their detestable things, and they will know that I am Yahweh. Not in vain I spoke to bring to them this evil. The language there of departed from me by their adulterous heart and adulterous eyes is like language of a husband talking to a wife that's left him. So when God says this, he's thinking of Israel as his bride. The language reflects his attitude towards them. You're my bride who has left me. But you will come back. There will be a time you'll come to your senses. So just a few things that I kind of thought about. What happens when a nation forgets? Did they forget the Deuteronomy stuff? Or if they didn't forget it, they sure ignored it. They rejected it. What happened to all of their rules, all the things that they were supposed to do? They got manipulated, they got changed to benefit them, not keep sacred that which was sacred, right? What happens to the sacred symbols of a nation when they forget? They're not sacred anymore, are they? They come down. They also become perverted. The temple, which was to be protected, now is filled with idols. What happens in our country? Are they not tearing down statues?
Yeah.
In Israel, the sacred was turned into the detestable. That's what's happening. We got to take these things down because, they're not appropriate anymore. Boom, we got to take them down, put something else up, right? Does any nation that goes against God get a pass? How bad is it for the one who knew and then turned away? You think about in the New Testament where it's like, I think it's Paul that says it had been better if they had never heard than to have heard and turned away. No passes. Can a nation's military and wealth deliver them from judgment? Not per Ezekiel. Your gold and your silver are just filth because God doesn't operate in that. You can't bribe him. You can't tribute enough to him. You can't fight against him. What's the only thing that can fix this problem? Repentance. You have to acknowledge what you've done and come back and beg for mercy and ask God to forgive you for what you've done. And then guess what? He does it. That's the crazy thing. They apparently did not seem to understand that. Will God use a pagan nation or pagan nations to judge those who abandon him? He will. There's a lot of ungodly leaders that God uses because he's got punishment or he's got a plan for his people.
He used Nebuchadnezzar a lot.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar was, and he got a wake-up call, but he was not a Christian by any means. Pagan. And God said, you're my instrument. And God will do, I don't think for a second he wouldn't do the same today. You can kick against it all day long, but the reality is if God wants to use a Russian leader, a Chinese leader, you name it, that might be the most vile of vile, to do what he wants to do to a country that's rejected him, will he do it? We have a good history that says he will. The best thing to do would be trying to say, God, we need to get back right with you before that ever happens. Before that ever happens. Does God throw the baby out with the bathwater? He does not. And that's the hope that comes with this, is there's that remnant that God knows there are some who will come to their senses. Or I think there's some, we're going to see this next week. There were some in the city that were already upset with what was happening. They were not on board with this idol worship and these detestable things. God handles them very specifically, handles them very uniquely in relation to how he handles the whole country. We're going to look at that next week. But no, he knows how to separate and keep those who are with him in the right place. He does not put his judgment and his punishment necessarily on them. Doesn't mean it's easy for them. Doesn't mean they don't have difficulties and they face all kinds of persecutions and tough things. But are they under the judgment of God? The wrath of God is a different question. Okay? So that'll be what we're going to look at next week, because God has a whole process he takes Ezekiel through to show him how he does this. Okay? And that's what we're going to look at next week. I wanted to show you this verse in Matthew 7. Enter through the narrow gate, because broad is the gate and spacious is the road that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it, because narrow is the gate and constricted is the road that leads to life, and there are only a few who find it. I think that applied just as much in Ezekiel's day than it does today, because there wasn't too many who got out. Ezekiel was one. Daniel was one. Shadrach, Meshach, these guys, Abednego, they get out. But there wasn't a lot of them, was there? And so it's not much different today. When God does delivering, there's not a lot of people who are willing to turn from their wickedness to him. A lot of people just want to stay in it. And so Jesus said the same thing. The human condition hasn't changed since Ezekiel's day. It really hasn't shifted. That's where we're going to stop for today.